Well, hey there, students. Today, this video is going to look at basic drawing techniques, and more specifically, what line is and how line works. So let's get started. A line is an abstract symbol that represents a path or an edge between two or more points. Did you know that lines don't actually exist in nature? That's because they're an abstract symbol, much like, say, an alphabet letter or like a number. They're things that we human beings have created from our brains to make sense of the world around us. Let's take a look at this rock. Can you find any lines on this rock? You might think you see a line here, or here, or here, or maybe this little dark area could be a line. Well, that's actually not true. If we zoom in really, really close, all we have is a change from dark to light. Lines are a way that we try to make sense of the world around us. How about this one? Again, if you get close, it's just a change from dark to light. The reason this happens is so that we don't bump into things when we are walking around in the woods, full of trees and full of rocks and all sorts of things. See, all there is just light rays coming out of the sun, and those light rays bounce off of a surface and go right back into our eye. That creates shadow and light. Areas where there's light, areas where there's no light. Now, for our brain to simplify that whole process, especially if we're in an area surrounded by a whole bunch of stuff, what ends up happening is our brain looks mainly at the outside edge of something. So this could be, like a tree, and we see all the tree bark and the interesting things that's happening in there. And when we look over in this direction, what's most important is that we see an area with lots of bumpy, weird wrinklies, and then an area where there's none of that. And so our brain looks at this outside edge and goes, uh-oh, time to walk around it. So we'd get our deer or kill our bear or run away from a bear, and we'd go back and put a stick in the dirt or draw in the dirt with our finger, and we'd show pictures of these crazy things that have just happened. Like over here, there was a bear. Rah, and then I ran like heck and got out of there. It's the easiest way to work. So lines are an abstract symbol that represent an edge, a path between two or more points. There are many types of lines. There are two major families of lines. The first type of line is called a contour line. A contour is French for outline. The most basic type of contour line would be a silhouette contour, where let's say you've got this leaf and you draw the outside of it, similar to that tree that you saw me draw earlier. Our brain looks at this and understands leaf. Our brains are very good at picking up patterns. So this is not really that difficult. You're hardwired to do this. So if the leaf is one thing, then it's also called a plane. It could also be considered a weird shape. A plane is a surface that's clearly and cleanly defined on all edges and closed by a line that starts and ends. That is contour line. The main focus for contour drawing is form, not detail. Now, contour line drawing also includes surfaces and planes inside of the major form as well. This is a drawing by Pablo Picasso. You guys have probably seen this in a variety of your art classes. As you can see, we have the outside of this figure, and then we have multiple planes inside of it, ranging from, let's say, this arm with interlocking fingers. It's clearly and cleanly defined on all edges on the outside. This arm section, forearm, has an outside contour. Everything's pretty much spelled out. There's no shading, there's no detail, it's strictly form. Contours can define the individual parts of an entire whole. We could separate an individual banana from the cluster by its contours. There are other little lines inside of this contour drawing, which we'll get to a little bit later. When do you use this stuff? Well, you've been doing it your entire life. Let's do some contour lines. Here is a blob. Now the blob has become a pear. Now let's suggest that part of this pear is in front of another part of it, kind of like it's got a bulge. Just like that, we put one line in charge of another. Let's try a non-example. Here is a pear. These are not contour lines. Contour lines are solid, clearly defined, and they seal an area. Contour lines are combined with a variety of other types of lines to achieve a variety of different effects. All right, let's have a little more fun. There are what are called cross-contour lines. So if a contour line defines the overall outside form or the defined surface planes of an object, cross-contour lines are used to define the surface features of a form, much like a topographical map. They're called cross-contours for a couple of reasons. They may cross over the surface of that plane. They may also cross over each other, similar to a grid. Cross-contours are the next step in mastering line drawing, mainly because they give you an understanding of form and volume and mass. You need to understand three-dimensional form in order to master this technique. It's really not as hard as you would think. We all live in three-dimensional space. Our brain is designed to interpret in a three-dimensional world, and if lines are a two-dimensional abstract symbol, then we combine the two when we draw. For example, we know that the bottom lip comes out and then goes down. With a little bit of practice, you'll get a feel for how sharp the curves are when you do a cross contour based on where they're pointing at you. Understanding what cross contour drawing is critical to understanding how light works on a form. And you guys have had exposure to this, and you know that there's a formula for three-dimensional volume. If we can place a form in three-dimensional space and have an understanding of that form using cross contours, we can understand where a light source could be and what surfaces on that form will directly hit light, will not directly hit light, and won't get any light at all. That translates directly over to shading and over into painting. All right, let's get literal into more technique. So there are what are called expressive lines. Lines can do a variety of very interesting things. Expressive means that a line is not dead and sterile, okay? Expressive means that lines can curve, they can change in thickness, they can accelerate, they can decelerate, they can accelerate, and they can decelerate. They can curve sharp, they can curve wide and slow. This creates energy and dynamic. Dynamic is a special word for change. Work that's expressive has life. For example, I could draw several individual lines just like this, or I could accelerate them like this. Do you see how they start bigger and they end smaller? These lines have more things going on, and that makes our brain trigger, oh, that's interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys some skills how to create expressive lines that have energy and dynamic in them. The first is called line weight. Line weight means exactly what you think it is. Some lines are heavy and some lines are thin. That means that you will thin and thicken a line for a deliberate and dynamic effect. There are 3 rules to line weight. The first rule is, let's say you've got 2 planes that intersect each other here, just like this. Well, rule number 1 is when 2 surfaces or surface planes intersect each other, the one that's closer to the viewer gets the heavier line. So that means I would bulk up the line weight of this plane to indicate that it is closer to the viewer, me. The second rule for line weight is that anytime you have a form or forms, the edge of that form that's furthest away from the light has the heavy line. So if we have both of these forms, then this little guy, and let's say the light is coming from this direction, then this little guy right here is going to get bulked up a little bit. This little guy is going to get bulked up a little bit, but nowhere near as much as this one, because we don't want to confuse the brain. All right. So if it's coming up from over this way, we might see just a little bit of line weight here, because this is the bottom of the form. All right. And so now that gives kind of a bumpy rised up kind of an effect. And finally, the third rule for line weight is that you make your lines thicker and heavier for emphasizing, for emphasis. So here's a fun little picture. Notice we've got all these action lines in the back. We've also got several buildings in the back. We've got smoke. We've got this mechanical robot type figure here, and the robot is the payoff. It's the centerpiece of the image. So I made the lines around the outside of the robot thicker than the lines behind the robot, especially the lines of the buildings. Here's a picture of a work in progress. If we turn off all of these layers and go straight to the line art, then let's see how line weight played a role in this. So here we've got kind of this belly of this little robot, and it is intersecting the plane of this robot's arm. So I had to enlarge that line in order to separate it from the arm over here. I had to enlarge the line from this pelvic joint and separate it from the line of its leg back over here. This leg is closer to us than this one, so this leg has a heavier line than this one. And that is line weight. In the end, it makes it pop off the paper. It gives a strong sense of dynamic energy to it. It's expressive, and it's almost as if you could brush your finger across the surface of the canvas and expect to feel certain parts of your drawing rise up. There is another technique called hatching, and some of you may have been exposed to this hatching almost as if it is a shading technique, kind of like this. Well, we're not talking about shading yet, though it's used for shading. Strictly in terms of drawing in lines, hatching is short strokes that repeat in intervals and in the same, or sometimes not the same, directions. So let's look at short intervals. So they're going in the same direction like this, and I'm going to increase the interval here. And now let's decrease the interval. We could call that frequency, how frequent or how often you make a stroke. All those ones went the same way. What if they sort of curved? What would that do? Does that look familiar with anything that you've seen in the video so far? Well, how about the cross contouring? Do you see how certain strokes are in intervals and they also curve at certain points and they curve at different directions in other points? Well, you can use hatching to suggest an edge on a form. Let's do that. Let's say that you've got a form like this, kind of like a cylinder, and it's done using contour. Well, if this is a curved form, like let's say this is the top and then it curves over, like that, how do we draw that edge without filling it full of a bunch of lines? Well, we could suggest that edge by using curved hatch strokes. That gives our brain kind of an understanding there could be a curved edge there. We could suggest texture like fur. We could change the direction and the flow of these lines in such a way to suggest that there's fur. We could change the length and the direction of these lines to suggest that there might be an edge of fur, and then put another edge of fur doing the exact same thing right behind it. Remember your line weight technique. Let's put another plane of fur behind this, and that suggests that this plane is actually farther away than this one. Now these are tightly controlled. Do you see how they all originate at pretty much the same point? Like here, here. Hatching strokes can also overlap each other. When things overlap, that creates a change in value. That can suggest that something is bumpy. So by grouping them together and creating value, we might suggest that there is a bump right here. Any of you guys have pimples? Well, let's try it. We've got a pimple right here. How do we indicate with hatching that there's a little edge right there? We can suggest an edge by adding hatching strokes. Hatching is also used for shading, and you do that by building up layers of hatch strokes bit by bit until it eventually turns solid. Now this also is controlled. If you want a good effect, try not to have your strokes go all over the place, and you'll find that in other videos that you've seen me make. So remember all of those line drawing exercises that I've had you guys do where you connect dots and so on. Well, that's to build you up to get the same motor skill to be able to do this. This is all, well, almost all hatching. I love hatching. This is a great example of hatching right here, where you have several strokes side by side at different pressures, going the same direction, and then building up on top of each other. Now let's look at a different type of line, and this one's a little more challenging. This was called implied line. Remember, a line is an edge that the brain sees. So an implied line is an edge that the brain sees by following shapes and different values, like light and dark, and by following different forms around a path. You don't literally draw a line in order to get an implied line. It's not directly done. But rather than drawing the actual line, we can create an implied line by simply putting two different values, so like gray and black, put them next to each other. That creates an edge that our brain sees to say that this and this are not the same thing. You can use angles to point the eye in such a way that it tricks your brain into thinking that there's a line here, just like with this invisible triangle. Here, all we have are black and white stripes, and where those black and white stripes change, that gives the illusion that there's actually a line here that's curving around. Implied line is the closest to nature because lines don't really exist. Remember, there is only a change in dark and light value for anything that looks like a line in nature. Therefore, if you draw using changes in dark and light rather than in line, you will be able to draw more realistic. This one on the left requires lines to define the outside of the apple. This one on the right does not. It uses the dark and the light of the paper and the change in that value to tell the brain that, hey, we've got an edge here. Let's create implied line with hatching. So I'm going to create a fur texture, and by doing that, I'm going to make big and small hatch strokes that change and flow into each other. Now you can see the implied line. Down here, where all the fur strokes start, there's no line there, but the brain thinks there is. Also, up here, where the strokes are doing their thing to suggest fur, there's no line there, but your brain thinks there is. You could draw fur like cartoony, like this, or you could draw fur cartoony like this. It still creates the same shape. One uses contour line, the other uses implied line. Implied line is closer to nature, therefore you may have a more successful effect depending on your goal in your drawing. Let's draw, say, like a bone using contour. And let's use an implied line to suggest that there might be an edge to this bone. So maybe this one is in front of this one, and it starts to break off. So I could hatch and indicate what's called a suggested edge on this form. Maybe this bone curves a little bit right down here, so I could indicate a suggested edge. Let's put some texture in there. Maybe there's a little divot or a knot. We can add a little hatching in here to make it look like there might be a little pit. Let's see how implied line was used with that, using hatching. There are no lines in this image with exception to his cute little mouth right there, and that was done on purpose to draw the eye to that area. These are many, 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 many small little hatch strokes that layer on top of each other. And let's look at this left arm right here. Do you see how there are no lines used to draw this arm? There's simply a dark, shadowy shape that ends with these little hatch strokes right here. And our brain looks at the change from dark to light and sees, oh, that's the outside edge of something. And so our brain will follow that and say, oh, that's an arm. Here is Easter Bunny Rampage. It's a combination of contour line drawing and hatching. And he is really mad. But if we look on the outside edge, we have mostly contour line here, and then it breaks and turns into hatch strokes, implied line in this area. And then we have hatch strokes here, here, and down here to indicate that he is fuzzy, all right? We have a suggested edge along the side of his nose right here. Rather than just having nostrils, I wanted to suggest that his nose turns under, and so I created an implied line here to do that. Let's look at cross-hatching. I have another video specifically on that. Cross-hatching is where you intersect hatch strokes from a variety of directions. For example, if I try to keep my lines the same direction here, it starts to eventually build up on itself. And you can suggest an edge with it as well. So let's have an edge suggested like this, and then let's give it a little value pass right like this by intersecting And it kind of gives a feel that this area curves under more than this one. So we've talked about suggestive edge. Let's talk about broken line. Broken line is when you have a line, except it starts to kind of fizzle out and it starts up again, like that. There is a reason for that oftentimes. That's called a point of tension. So what happens there is when light hits a surface, let's say light is going to hit this area and it's going to get all shiny, all right? So rather than draw a solid line, you could have that line kind of fizzle out and then start back up again to indicate that there was shadow there. And we could hatch to suggest like a bit of a glow happening here. And this little fella right there, that's the point of tension. Another purpose for the use of a broken or suggestive line is what's called a halo. So you remember the example for line weight that you saw earlier. Well, one of the things that you can do to suggest that some of these lines are more important than others, that some lines are in charge while the rest are not, is to subtly break the line here and here. Like, don't actually let them touch. See, here they touch, and that's okay, but if you have areas where they don't, it again creates more expressive line work. It has an area for your mind to rest when it goes from one plane to another. A halo can be created to allow the brain to look at that dominant form and not be confused. And we do that by not coming into direct contact sometimes with that major form. If we look over here on the side of this robot, notice that none of these other planes that are behind this front face of this robot touch. The lines break or they stop abruptly before they get there. That's a fun drawing technique that you could use. That's how you tell your viewer that this is in front of this. So the process of line drawing that you usually see among a variety of disciplines is that there's usually a beginning scaffold, just like you've learned all semester, that's drawn first. That's done at pressure 1, very lightly, very, very lightly. And then on top of that is where the drawing takes place. And then you can just erase out any leftover scaffolding, like you can see some down here, or you can leave it in there, which gives you a lot of really cool, free micro details in your work that you can work into your shading. So let's summarize. Lines don't exist in nature. Lines are just abstract symbols that can be manipulated to trick the brain into thinking that it's seen an edge. There are many types of lines, the most basic of which is a contour line covering the outside of a plane. That can also cover individual planes inside of a major plane as well. Cross-contour lines are lines that define the surface features like a topographical map. It also helps you have an understanding of three-dimensional space when you translate over into shading and painting and sculpting. Implied lines are different. It's an edge that the brain sees. It's tricked into seeing it based on like the dark and the light, or what direction forms are pointing, or what areas shapes are located at. It's also the closest to nature. So if you want to draw realistically, master implied line. If you want to be a painter, master implied line. Because ultimately painting is just painting different colored light on your canvas. That's it. There are what are called expressive lines. Those are lines that curve and become organic. They have rounded edges. They accelerate, they change in thickness, and they decelerate. To make your line expressive, use line weight. That's where you thicken and thin a line for a deliberate effect. There are a variety of ways to suggest these implied lines and do texture. Those are hatching, cross-hatching, and broken lines. Review this as needed, and we'll go over to more practical applications in class. Have a great day. Bye-bye.